All right, welcome everybody. I'm Jeff Hanke from the Nutmeg Division, and be giving a clinic today on car forwarding and setting up the Micromark car card and Waybills system. So, getting right into it, our agenda, we're going to talk about what is car forwarding, the concept of blocking that is used on the railroads, a little known topic about car service rules, with an excellent example about a Monon car routing that I think you'll find interesting. Then we'll talk about setting up the actual car cards, the waybills, and then how to use them in model railroad operations. So as a background, car forwarding is actually kind of a misnomer because it's not individual cars that are being forwarded across the layout. It's actually blocks. Railroads operate in blocks. So model railroaders think of individual cars, but to be honest with you, a train and a railroad company is trying to make money. So they try to put things together and move things in similar directions that are no matter how many cars it is, be it 1 or 15 or 50. So what we're going to use as an example here is my personal layout is the east end of the Cumberland subdivision. I've made a little graphic here that shows the Cumberland yard and the Brunswick yard are the two major yards on my layout. They're both division yards. And that's where all of the classification happens. That is where blocks are created and blocks are broken. It's also where trains terminate and originate from. But in between those two division yards, and probably the same thing applies on whatever layout you own, there are a number of different types of interchanges and minor yards that see action throughout your layout. So Green Spring, for example, is a small interchange with the South Branch Valley Railroad, and they probably get a couple hundred cars a year. But mainline trains only set out blocks there and picked up blocks. I shouldn't say mainline trains. They're served by a local train. Paw Paw, which is just an industry on the main line, is actually the same. It's served by a local. Mainline trains don't stop there, and they just continue on by. Martinsburg, a minor yard that has a branch line connected to it, they get mainline trains to stop there and set out blocks and pick up blocks of cars, but that branch line is served by a local train. Now, one of the major interchanges I have on my layout is Shenandoah Junction, which is Norfolk and Western interchange, and they interchange thousands of cars a year. But it's still the same thing. A mainline train comes by, just like another interchange, but they'll drop off cars and they'll pick up cars. I also have a subdivision that branches off of my layout, and that's the Shenandoah subdivision. And mainline trains go down the branch and they serve all the industries down there and come back. So basically, I use this as an example of the sort of things that traffic happens on a railroad. But what we're going to talk about, I have the yellow star on the right-hand side of the graphic, is we're going to happen what happens when a train comes in from a point east, Baltimore in my case, into the first division yard. So I call it train double X. It's coming in from Baltimore and it's heading west, and it stops at Brunswick Yard and it gets a different crew, different power, and a different caboose. But what happens is all of these cars are jumbled up in the train and not blocked to east end destinations. And there's a very important point for that. The reason they are not blocked into the train by their identical destination is because, according to Baltimore, all of these cars are just going to points west. They're going from Brunswick and beyond. So they don't really care in Baltimore which cars go to which of the east end destinations. They only know that they're going to the next major classification yard and beyond. So they're sending them in that direction while they send other trains north, they send other trains south. These trains that come west stop at Brunswick to get classified. And what I've done is I've color coded all the cars in the train just to make it visually understandable by the colors that match what tracks in the yard they go to. It's an important concept to remember that tracks in a yard are actually earmarked for certain destinations. And so that as trains come in and they are classified, all the cars going, let's say, to their storage and staying in Cumberland go on the track that says storage. All the cars that are going west of Cumberland go into that track. And I just used a rainbow of colors there to make it easy to understand how the cars in the train match what destination track they will be put into. So many model railroaders have their trains depart unblocked like this. And when they show up, Now, that would happen if you go into a major classification yard. It does not happen when it leaves this yard. And you see that a lot on model railroads, that cars are unblocked in a train leaving a yard heading up the line. So major railroads don't want to do that because it's inefficient and it causes a lot of extra effort. Us as modelers, we sometimes want to give those people that extra effort, the extra challenge to shuffle out the cars in a train as it goes up the line. But you'll notice as we go through the graphics that is not the way you leave. It's the way you show up, but it's not the way you leave. Also note, before I go to the next slide, that there's no depiction here as to whether or not a car is empty or loaded. It doesn't matter at this point. These are just cars that are being routed over the road. So the little yard engine comes out and shuffles all the cars into each appropriate track. So that's what I'm depicting here. The 2 cars that are in storage have been put up there, the 2 for West Cumberland, the 1 for Cumberland, they've all been put in their appropriate track. Okay, so then what happens next? So you've got these cars that arrived and realize that there's probably cars from other trains that are filling up the yard, but we're just using this one train as an example. So then what happens is these cars have to go to their destinations on the east end. So the next west major yard is Cumberland. So what happens is you have a train, the schedule's made, train YY, for example, originates at Brunswick Yard. And its schedule is to set out and pick up cars at Shenandoah Junction, Shenandoah Subdivision, and Hancock. And then it ends in Cumberland. So the yard crew puts together the appropriate blocks. And you see by my color code, it's the dark blue, the medium blue, the green, and the yellow. And then they tack on some power on the front. They put a caboose on the end, and they head west up to Cumberland. This would be a mainline train, and it would stop along the way at Shenandoah Junction, Shenandoah Subdivision, and drop off cars. Okay. Let's say another train, Train ZZ, does the same thing, but it takes cars from Martinsburg and Green Spring, and it continues west and it terminates in Chicago. So it's going beyond Cumberland, so it will take the cars straight through Cumberland to points beyond. So that leaves 2 types of cars that are for a local and cars for storage. Well, local cars are ones that would be served out of this yard to industries that are before the next major classification yard. And for example, my train WW here will work all the local industries, and then when it's done, it comes back to Brunswick Yard. So same basic evolution, except a local generally comes back to its same home. So it does a circle. So that really leaves a major question for us, and something that I really want to stress because I don't think a lot of model railroaders really understand this concept, is what happens to the empty cars. Those red cars came to Brunswick. They were unneeded. They were excess. They were empty, and they got put on a storage track. Or you could also have a car that recently got emptied by a local that came back, and it's also in the yard, and it's empty, and it hasn't moved yet. So what do you do with those cars? Well, the answer is actually different as to who owns the car. So there's a concept of home road and foreign road. Home road is your own road. For example, I model the B&O in the Chessie era. So B&O, C&O, and Western Maryland cars, all the parts of the Chessie system, are home road cars. The foreign road cars are everybody else. So Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, Cotton Belt, those are all foreign road cars. But what's really interesting is there's a set of rules that are set called car service rules that all of the railroads are supposed to abide by. So let's take a look at the car service rules. Okay. Now, the good news is if you own a railroad, you control all of your home road cars on your own line. So for me, the B&O, C&O, Western Maryland cars, if they're on your line today, you can do whatever you want with them. Okay? That is your own prerogative. Now, keep in mind, all railroads want to make money. So running loaded cars, not empties, are actually in the best interest of all the railroads. That allows the assets across all the railroads to be utilized much better. Also, there's a concept in railroading called per diem, where if a foreign-owned car is on your line, you have to pay for it every day that it's on your line. So removing those foreign cars off of your line and giving them back to their original owner, or at least another railroad in that direction, stops the bill of you having to pay per diem. So that's good. Now, a foreign road empty which can't be loaded if you're at your facility. In other words, you have no use for that car. You route that car back from the way it came, the exact routing, the reverse routing. And the reason that's done is the concept of sharing revenue and costs. So whatever railroads got the revenue for bringing that load to your facility, they need to share in the cost of shipping that empty car back to where it belongs. So foreign empties that can't be loaded, number one, go back in the reverse routing. But there's a concept here that's rarely modeled. And that is the fact by the car rules, a foreign empty that can be loaded, that you can use, is actually confiscated by your railroad. And then you route your load in a foreign car to some other destination. Now, we'll talk about a couple good examples here coming up, but this is the concept of car rules, is how to choose a foreign empty car to use in your load on your railroad to ship it somewhere else. Okay, there are a couple exceptions from these rules. So I should state that the car service rules are railroad to railroad rules. If you have a captive service car, in other words, a car that says stenciled on it, when empty, return to, it is not supposed to be used in the car service rules. It is not supposed to be confiscated. If you have a privately owned car, any car that ends in an X, RBox, GunX, UTLX, you see the list there. Anything that owns in an X is a privately owned car. They are exempt from the car service rules. In other words, myself as a B&O modeler cannot confiscate those cars to be used to ship my own loads. There is an exception that occurred during my era, which I thought I would highlight, and that is the government incentivized railroads, small railroads, to invest in boxcars in the late 1970s and 80s because the major railroads were not investing enough, and the World War II era boxcars were starting to become too old to get interchanged. So to incentivize small railroads to invest in boxcars, they created up what was called the incentive per diem boxcar concept, which actually did two things. It greatly increased the per day amount of money you get for owning a boxcar, but it also allowed the boxcar to be exempt from these car service rules. So you may have seen in places very small railroads continuing to show up in photographs, right? Nevada Northern was one. St. Lawrence is another. PhD is another. I mean, you see a lot of very common small road boxcars, and that is because they've built thousands of them to take advantage of the incentive per diem program. Okay. Now let's talk about a hardline example here. Okay. So I made a nice little chart. So this, I'm a B&O modeler, right? It's a chassis system B&O line. I'm going to have a load, whatever load it is. Let's say it's a load of appliances, right? And these appliances are going to come out on the Baltimore and Ohio, but it's going to go to some other place on the Baltimore and Ohio. I use my own car. The car you want to pick for that sort of trip, the originating road is my road and the terminating road is my road. You want to pick your own car. Why? Because you don't pay anybody per diem for it, and you get all of the revenue and all the per diem. It's perfect. Okay. The only reason you would not use your own car in this first scenario is that there's none of your cars available. That probably will never happen, but it could. So let's look at the first one where you actually have to interchange the car. So you have a B&O load, this load of appliances that's originating on my railroad, but it's destined to a facility on the Norfolk and Western. So here's the concept. So you want to take a car that is going, a foreign owned car that is going to the home district, through the home district, or near the home district. Those are the only three words you need to understand: to, through, and near. And your first choice is one going to the home district. So if you have, as you see in my example here, your priority one choice is you have a Norfolk and Western empty car in your yard that you're not using, but you have a load. You put your load in that Norfolk and Western car and send it to the Norfolk and Western. Okay? Let's say you don't have any Norfolk and Western cars. Well, then what you do is you pick this Southern car that you have in your yard because your priority 2 car is it's near. You don't have any that are going through the Norfolk and Western because you actually border the Norfolk and Western. So there's nothing between the two of you to go through. So you have to pick a car that's near. And that would be the Southern car or Florida East Coast car. Notice there's no Union Pacific car here because that's a Western Railroad. You'd only use that sort of car if you had nothing else that could run the load. So let's look at the bottom two are a little more complicated. If you have a Baltimore and Ohio load, so the load's originating on your Baltimore and Ohio, but it's destined to go to the Southern, okay? Let's say it's going to Atlanta, Georgia or something, right? It's got to go through the Norfolk and Western to the Southern to get there. Your number one priority in that same yard scenario is actually now to pick the Southern car to do that because that's where it's going to. Your second priority is to actually pick the Norfolk and Western car because you're going through the Norfolk and Western to get to the Southern. And then your last choice is to pick that Florida East Coast car because it's at least near Atlanta, right? And then for the long haul, let's say you've got a load, the same load that's now going all the way to Florida. Well, you'd pick that Florida car first because that's where it's going to. But if you couldn't, you'd pick both, either one, the Norfolk and Western or the Southern, because you're going to be routing the car through. So the concept is really very easy when you understand by some examples. You want a car that's going to its home district, through its home district, or near its home district. And I use the term home district here. People who really know about these rules, the United States was divided into 23 home districts, okay? But you can think of as a modeler the home district as that railroad. It just makes it a lot easier. But the reality is home districts may be cover more than one home district may cover a railroad, right? But just kind of think of a home district as the railroad, and it makes it much easier to understand. So here's a very hard example of where the money goes. And this explains why the routing is the way it is. So you have a picture there, Northern Pacific boxcar number 6167, right there in the photo. It's empty in Brunswick, right? The B&O agent in Brunswick, Maryland, which is on my layout, fills it up with a load of appliances on January 1st, 1982. And it's destined for Omaha, Nebraska. Okay? So I made the numbers round just so it makes the math easy, but keep in mind they use the actual mileage, right? So the car travels from Brunswick 1,500 miles to Chicago. That's all on the B&O. Then it interchanges to the Chicago Northwestern on the 3rd of January. The Chicago Northwestern picks it up and runs it to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a distance of 500 miles, and drops it off the next day on the 4th of January. Then it travels on the Union Pacific to Omaha, Nebraska, another 500 miles, and on the 5th of January, it is delivered to its destination. So who got the money? So the revenue for the load is split up between the distance of travel. So the B&O got 60% of the money, Chicago Northwestern got 20%, the UP got 20%. But here's something that's interesting. The per diem actually went to the Northern Pacific because they own the boxcar. So the the Northern Pacific made money by having that boxcar move back towards its own home rails. That's the whole concept. That is using the asset appropriately. So instead of shipping this boxcar empty all the way to Omaha, Nebraska, everybody got to make money on it heading that way. And they got 4 days of per diem, right? They went to the B&O for 2 days worth of it. They went to the CNW for 1 day, and they went to the UP for 1 day. Back in the time I model in 1982, it was midnight, which was the time you determined whether or not you paid per diem for that boxcar or not. So there was always an incentive for you to drop these cars off at 11:59 p.m. on the interchange track for the other railroad and stop paying the per diem. Today, they do it by hour. So every day, every car is clocked by hour on what railroad it's on. And at the end of every month and the end of every year, they all settle up with each other in terms of who owes who for what. And just as background, if you don't know, the Eastern railroads are receiving railroads. They get a lot more cars onto their lines than they ship away. So it is CSX and Norfolk Southern that routinely want to ship empty boxcars off of their line and empty all sorts of cars, not just boxcars, all cars off their line because they're paying per diem for them. They want to get them off and get them back to the Western routes. Okay. I did want to put in there, there's a little picture of one, just as the asterisk to this entire thing, is the IPD boxcars in the late 70s and 80s were exempt for these rules. And they just ran the entire system load to load to load to load to load. They never got routed empty. And they actually had freight agents that were routing their cars to the next load all the time. So this irritated the big class 1 railroads, and they went around to try to stop this program. If you're a Conrail modeler, Conrail didn't play with the rules, and they actually shipped all their boxcars, whatever IPD boxcar they had, they shipped it back to the home road anyway. So this is really kind of an interesting concept of car service rules. Is rarely modeled. I think it's a very interesting part of how real railroads work. And as you look into running the micromark system, this is something that you want to roll into operations. Okay. Now, as a note on the bottom there, the load, the actual appliances, is the waybill that was filled out by the B&O agent, and it actually rides with the car. It's actually with the conductor in the caboose in my era, but that paperwork rides with the load all the way till its destination. And the reason I point that out is that waybill that in this day and age is a full piece of paper, we use in the micro car card system with an itty bitty little card. But I said I would give you a good example of what this looks like in real life. The Monon Railroad, which is a very small railroad in Indiana, advertised that they put out boxcar number 1. Actually, it was a single-digit road number boxcar. They put it out on the road for a year, and they ran an advertisement showing where that boxcar went. And as you can see, they're utilizing the rules throughout this entire year. You can see there were some moves here that didn't make sense. If you look for the Texas to California route, is that heading towards Indiana in any way? No. But you got to remember one thing about these car rules too. There's no penalty for not abiding by them. So why would a railroad in Texas take this car and ship it to California when it's against the rules? And it's really something very simple. Remember I said this is a brand new boxcar? Of course, they're going to keep the brand new boxcar and go give it to a customer because that customer will be happy that they have a brand new boxcar to ship their product in. They're not going to take an old rusty beat up car to their customer because they have to continue that relationship with the customer. There was actually a Boston and Maine article I read where one of their officials on the Boston and Maine bought 1,000 new boxcars, and they said, what a great investment. How do you feel about this? And the railroad official's response was, I'll never see him again. And he was right. And why they never see him again? Because other railroads said it's a brand new boxcar and I'm going to use it. So it's really hard to abide by the rules when there's no penalties, but you were supposed to abide by the rules is my point. All right, so let's talk about the car card and waybill system. So you need to kind of understand two things to really do this, okay? You need to research what car types moved to your industries and off of your industries, but then you also need to research when trains went across your section of railroad, how were the blocks moved? And that's what we're going to talk about. So let's talk first about industry research, okay? So you have say you want to model a prototypical part of the line, but you don't know what industries are on that line. How can you find that out? Well, one great thing is a timetable. You may be saying, but Jeff, timetables are for passenger trains. True, but there are actually elements in an employee timetable that talk about restrictions about certain railroads, locomotives were too heavy to go to certain sidings. And if you look, the sidings are named. So here's a good example in my Maryland Division timetable from 1980, the Shenandoah Cinder Block Company, the Virginia Apple Storage Company, the Charlestown Grain and Feed Company. Those are all names of industries that are served by the railroad. So you can find what industries are on your railroad, and then you can really Google what that type of industry gets. What sort of cars do those type of industry get? Okay. Now, another thing is to go to the OPSIG group. So OPSIG is an NMRA, sort of division or sort of group. But what they do is they have a list online. You can find it today of thousands and thousands of industries at thousands and thousands of locations. So it's an incredible online reference for you. You can also reach out to Facebook groups for your part of the line and ask questions and find former employees that will let you know. All good ways to find the industries. So then what do you do when you find your industry? So here on the left is a list of every industry on my layout. Okay, and I blew one up for you here, the Kelly Springfield Tire Company in North Branch. So the Kelly Springfield Tire Company makes tires. They ship tires. They ship tires in boxcars. They also ship tires in trucks, but that's not interesting to us. Okay, but what it receives carbon black, which is a sooty type of black powder, silica, rubber, nylon, steel, petroleum, and sulfur. And then what sort of cars they come in. Recognize that for every spot on an industry you have to really operate your trains, you're going to need to create at least 2 cars. So for carbon black, if there was one spot at Kelly Tire for a carbon black car, one is going to be there getting emptied, and then another one is going to need to come when that empty one is pulled out, and they're going to want more because they're always making tires. So they're going to need a continual feed of carbon black. So keep that in mind. 2 cars for everyone. And so what does that do? Now that I know every industry and I know every type of car and I know how many spots are at each industry, I can actually create what I've done here is a roster of what you need to operate the layout. Okay. So to service all of those industries, and I've divided it up both for home roads and foreign roads, but you can see I track all of my cars and make sure that I'm building the ones needed to service the industries. Okay, so let's talk about making our first car card. So the Micromark system, you can go out and purchase a bulk starter set. And that's what I'd recommend for anybody starting. And the first thing that you want to do is, as you complete cars, is you want to create the car card. And the car card represents the car, not the load. It represents just the car. And you make the car for in the yellow tablet, everything that is not a locomotive. And as you can see how I filled them out here, and we'll focus on the Western Maryland hopper on the right. So what type of car it is, I put under kind, just normal text. It's a 3-bay hopper. Now, the AAR, the American Association of Railroads, has a letter designation. A 3-bay hopper is HT. Okay, that's going to be important in a minute. Now, the railroad and the road number is Western Maryland. You can see it on the left-hand side of the car, right below the word Western, is WM, and then there's the road number, 72042. Description, you can put whatever you want in a description. I put the color of the car. And I write it, you don't have to, I actually write it in the color of the ink, okay? But what's important about the car card system, and frankly, I don't think a lot of railroaders use this enough, is the actual empty home of the car is written on the card. Empty car returned to, in this case, Elkins, West Virginia. I use a system, it works very well, I think, which if the city is not on my layout, in other words, it's not modeled, I use the state. So Elkins, West Virginia. But underneath it, in parentheses, I put where on the layout it exits from. So to get to Elkins, West Virginia, it's west of Cumberland. Cumberland's the westernmost part of my railroad, so I put in parentheses Cumberland. So in other words, I'm trying to remove the need for all of my operators to have, a graduate level knowledge of geography. And so basically, all you need to worry about is I need to route this car to Cumberland when it's empty. Okay, you can see from the model it's full, but when it's empty, that's what you do. You do these for cabooses as well. If you're in the caboose era like I am, the AAR designation for caboose is NE. Don't know why, but that's what it is. Okay, I've done something, I don't know of any other modelers who have done this, but what I do on my car cards for ones that don't interchange is I put these hashed red lines and do not interchange in big letters. And there's a number of cars that don't interchange, right? In other words, these would be exempt from going to an interchange track and going to anybody else's railroad. Maintenance of way equipment's the biggest one, but also any car over 40 years of service in my era is not allowed to be interchanged. And so, for example, on the right-hand side there, that old two-bay hopper is so old it can't be interchanged, but I can still run it from a B&O mine to the B&O docks in Baltimore and ship coal with it and make money. But I just can't go give it to the Norfolk and Western. So that's why I put the do not interchange. That's also the case if you happen to have a steel mill. I do not, but cars like that, there's some cars that are captive in their industry forever and they never leave. That's the same thing you would do with those type of cars. This is a list just for a reference. You can get this online, but just kind of graphically an example of some of the codes I use. These are the AAR codes. These are in the upper right-hand corner of every one of my car cards. Now, locomotives, they also, if you get the starter set of the Micro Car card set, you get the gray pad. And the gray pad is for locomotives. It's basically the same, except for the fact it has a line for DCC address, which I put the road numbers DCC address. I think that's common for all model railroaders. But I also run a lot of dummies. So the DCC address for 6655 there in the example just says dummy. That's so that my operators know that that locomotive won't move on its own. Okay. So shifting gears here a little bit from car cards is to understand how the traffic on your route is routed. And to the left is probably what would drive this point home the most for someone who has never heard of this before. So on the left, from February of 1984, is an actual employee sheet of the schedule of train across the East End. And in particular, this train is called the Virginia. So if you look here, it's a daily train on the top. It goes from Cumberland to Potomac Yard. If anybody knows where Potomac Yard pretty much was, it really doesn't exist very much anymore. It's by the National Airport in Washington, D.C. Okay? So it's got to travel 168 miles, and it has a 9-hour and 45-minute schedule. And it tells you here, it leaves from Cumberland, goes through Cherry Run, goes through Martinsburg, goes through Brunswick, and then goes to Potomac Yard. Now, in my layout, all of those are on my layout except the Potomac Yard. Okay? But what's really interesting about this piece of paper is if you look here on the classification section, from Cumberland, block 74MA, block 78, block 74SJ, and block 74 start on the train. And if you look down here at what the definitions are, that tells you what blocks it's taking. So it's taking Brunswick and beyond cars. It's taking Martinsburg Auto Park cars. It's taking Shenandoah Junction cars. And it's taking Potomac Yard cars. And then as it stops at each one of its subsequent stops, it tells you what it's doing. At Cherry Run, it sets out the Martinsburg cars. You see the little SO there, right there, SO Martinsburg. It also picks up any cars going to Potomac Yard that happen to be there. It keeps the ones for Shenandoah Junction, and then it picks up any cars for Brunswick and beyond. So the train gets shorter with the Martinsburg car, but it adds length with the other two blocks that it picks up. It does the same thing at Martinsburg and at Brunswick, and then continues to its termination. Now, at the bottom, it tells you at Potomac Yard all of its connections. So these are the sort of home roads or beyond that would be going to the Potomac Yard. So this piece of paper, and I have this for every single train across the East End, was really an amazing find. I would highly encourage you to look at your specific railroads historical societies to see if they have such a document, because this has really defined every single train across the East End for me. And graphically on the right there, I have showed you what those look like. And so trains traveling to the west are in solid, trains traveling to the east are in the dash line. And if you look down here, this kind of purpley dash line is the Virginia, going from 1415 all the way down to finishing at 1855 in Brunswick. So that's the train we're talking about. Okay. What if you can't find that document? Well, it's even probably possible for you to find what is called a tower sheet or a train sheet. Okay. And this is one from my railroad, September 28th of 1982. Mexico, Maryland is the tower in Cumberland. So this is the westernmost point on my railroad. Now, if you look at it, it tells you a lot of things. Having the westernmost point tells you things that are leaving and entering your layout. I mean, it's nice to know who the tower operator was and when they were on duty. That's great. If you look over on the right here, it tells you the weather. It was 60 degrees and cloudy, got a little cooler down to 58. But over here on train or engine, if you look down here on all these westward trains, right? These are all the ones that are coming off the east end, passing the western Monon Point, heading west of Cumberland. These are all of the engine numbers for those trains. But if you look over here in the remarks section, these are actually the names of those trains. Because Chessie ran everything as an extra, you got to know the actual locomotive number at the front off every one of these train sheets, but in the remarks, it told you which train it was. In particular, notice 441 is an Amtrak train. That is not a Chessie train. That's why it says Amtrak 273 was the lead locomotive. And if you look over here on the right-hand side, VRGN, that's the Virginian. That's the train we were talking about. And it was led by locomotive 3713 that day. Okay? You can take a lot from this. So really also, if you look here, let's see if we can point it out real quick. In the remarks section, right next to the train name is the number of loads and empties in those trains. So this coal train was 148 loads and 0 empties heading to the east. Pretty interesting. Here's a empty coal train heading back, 0 loads, 131 empties. So you can kind of understand the traffic when you have a train sheet like this. Even almost comically noted, right here is when they called the crew taxi for each of the crews that stopped at the tower at the end of their shift, and when they called the taxi and when it arrived. So there's a lot of great information on these sheets. I'd encourage you to get them. I've got a number of them from across my line, and again, things like historical societies, eBay, things like that. You can find these for your road as well. So I use that to create a train sheet. This is something an operator can use. It basically, from the previous documents you saw, I boil it down to regular English so that they understand what they're doing. I won't go through them in detail, but you can see there, it basically looks like that piece of paper I showed you earlier, and it explains what you're supposed to do in the notes at the bottom in plain English. And this gives them basically the recipe for what they need to do when they get a train. All right. So switching gears again, let's talk about your industries and what are the possible options for a freight car at any given industry. And the industry in the middle there is the classic factory icon, right? So an industry can have an empty car come in, but very, very rarely is that same empty car leave. And the only reason that would really happen would be that the shipper rejects the empty car. So this factory has asked for a car, it's a little gondola. That little gondola shows up and it says, no, it's broken, it's dirty, it's rusty, I can't use it, whatever. It's too short for the product I'm putting in it, whatever. And then the railroad will come by and pick that empty up and give them a different empty. So that very rarely happens. What very commonly happens is they call for that empty gondola. It comes in. A good example is a coal car, right? The mine calls for that car to come in. They fill it, and then you're going to use the blue empty action card we'll talk about in a second to order that car to come to your industry. But then when it gets filled, you put a waybill in there, and we'll talk about a waybill in a second, to go route that load to where that load needs to go. Now, also very common is for a load to show up, right? Let's take a power plant, for example. That same load of coal comes in. When it gets to that power plant, they use the coal, they burn it to make electricity, and then they send the empty out. So you only need the waybill to bring the load to your power plant. Once it's empty, that part of the car card that says where to route it empty kicks in, and that tells you where to send that car now that it's empty. Now, something that's also very rare, but is amazing how often this is modeled in model railroading, is a loaded car comes in to an industry, and that same exact loaded car goes out with a different load. Okay? Most cars are specialized and won't do that. There could be a scenario like, for example, a boxcar where it's loaded with packing material that comes in, and they're putting canned goods in it at that factory, and they use the same car because it's clean, it's the right size, it'll fit the right things. And the railroad could do that, but it's very, very rare. But you would also need a waybill to bring it to your factory to do that, and you'd need a different waybill to ship the now green colored load out of that factory. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. All right, So Micromark's Waybills. So when you do the purchase the bulk pack, starter pack, you'll get a pack of 4-cycle Waybills. And the reason they're called 4-cycle Waybills is because on the little piece of paper, they have a 1, a 2, and if you flipped it over, they have a 3 and a 4. And the reason they do that is, frankly, it's just to save paper. Sometimes people, what they do is they use these Waybills to route loaded to loaded to loaded to loaded. And that actually is not prototypical, right? So your car will be loaded and then it will need to go empty somewhere. And then it'll be loaded again and it'll go empty some different place, right? But a lot of model railroaders misuse the waybill system and just have loaded cars going loaded to loaded to loaded to loaded. So don't underestimate the value of having empty cars in your trains and empty cars across your layout. Okay, so I do something here as well. I talked about the red hash marks on the car card itself when it was do not interchange. I use the black hash marks on a waybill when it's a unit coal train, for example, in this case. So when it's a unit train, I don't want to make 25 waybills. I don't want to write the same thing 25 times on 25 different pieces of paper. Instead, I'll just make one waybill for the entire unit train and put a series of, put all the empty car cards together and then just use only one waybill for it. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right, so that the process of understanding your industries and the car it takes and your cars, you will go through and actually make these waybills for every single location you have and every single load that either comes or goes from your industries. And you're going to make a lot of them. I mean, a lot of them. I have pads of these cars and I have made dozens and dozens and dozens of these because you'll realize how complex it is to ship things in and out across a large layout. Okay. So let me go back one slide and explain on this chart in the middle how to read a waybill. It's probably best read right here on this insulated boxcar. So if you look at a waybill, and what I've done is in the upper right-hand corner of all of my waybills, I put the AAR code for what type of car would use this load. And what that does is make sure, you see it says RBL, RBL. If you can see that, it says RBL right here for this type of car, and it says RBL right here for this type of load. That way you know you have the right type of load and the right type of car, and you're not trying to put coal inside this boxcar, right? So, so what it is, if you look at the bottom, it's canned potatoes, okay? And it's shipped from Del Monte in Wisconsin, and it's going to Olympic Food in Alexandria, Virginia, routing to Brunswick via means through Cumberland. So this tells you basically everything you need to know. But really, you could disregard and you don't even need to fill in the shipper if you didn't want to, or where it's going to. That's not really needed, or the address. I do it just because, I think it's interesting and lets people kind of get an idea of what's really going across the railroad. But all you really need in this system is you're routing this car to Brunswick through Cumberland. So it would enter my layout on the western side in Cumberland, and you would ship it all the way across the railroad because Alexandria, Virginia is not on my railroad. It's to the east, right? So it's not stopping. This is what would be called bridge traffic. It starts west of my railroad, goes all the way across it, and then it terminates some point off my railroad to the east. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about action cards real quick. There's two types of action cards that come with the system. The first one is the pink action card, which is the bad order card. What you're supposed to do is if something's wrong with a card, you're supposed to write on it what's wrong. For example, in my photo here, the broken coupler. And then what an owner of the layout like myself would do is recognize that there's something wrong with this car, and I got to go take it to the workbench and fix it. In that case, that's what happens when the car takes a header and hits the floor and breaks the coupler. All right. The other one that comes, and that frankly, I've operated a number of layouts with the Micromark car card system, and I have yet to have anybody use this card. Everybody gets this card when you get the bulk pack, but nobody uses this. Well, this is really the order to bring an empty car to an industry, and it should be used more often. And I'm going to show you here on the right-hand two pictures how that works. So at the start of an operating session, this blue card is sitting there in Hancock, West Virginia on my layout. Hancock, West Virginia is the yard closest to Berkeley Springs. Berkeley Springs has a pulpwood facility where they load pulpwood onto pulpwood flat cars. Okay. So the owner of the West Vaco company in Berkeley Springs has asked right here for 2 LPs. LP is a pulpwood flat car, right? Pulpwood flat, LP, 2 of them. Where? West Vaco company in Berkeley Springs. How do you get there? The Hancock yard. It's a branch off the Hancock yard. In the Hancock yard, which is where this picture was taken, there's 2 flat pulpwood cars already. This CNO 81812 and this Western Maryland 1407. Hey, they've satisfied the need. So what'll happen is you'll put this blue card with these 2 yellow cards together, and the next local will take them down and spot them at the West Vaco pulpwood yard. Now, that's usually all that happens on that one op session. If you want to, you can come by and plop the little wooden loads in the car and then put the waybills in that say, okay, the shipper is still West Vaco from Berkeley Springs with the pulpwood in it. They're going to ship it to the pulp and paper plant in Luke, Maryland. And that's west of Cumberland, and it's got to go through Hancock. So that's what this waybill says. Notice LP. Notice that this is a waybill for pulpwood. This is a car for pulpwood. That should let you know that you have a good match. And you can see the pulpwood in the picture, and they get routed via the waybill, picked up out of Cumberland on the next train that has on its routing to pick up cars as it goes by Cumberland heading to Cumberland. And they'll pick those 2 cars up and they'll go down the road with whatever train it is that picks them up. Okay. So I would highly encourage people to really start using the blue cards. They're not used enough. You can also buy these boxes for Micromark. I paint mine black. They come a natural wood color. And what you do is you put them on the fascia, and you have one for every track. And then as you drop cars off, you put them into the track. So if you actually look at this, all of this will match the cars that are on the tracks above this picture. All right, so just a couple last slides here on model railroad operations and how do you use this system. We talked about unit coal trains, unit grain trains, trailer run flat car for my part of the railroad. None of those things stop on my railroad. They start either east or west of Cumberland, and they end either east or west of Brunswick. They just go from the extremes of the railroad. Okay. This is the easiest of all scenarios for any of your operators to use. This is what a first train should be for anybody who is getting introduced to car cards and waybills, because frankly, they don't have anything to do with them, right? They'll just basically pick up their train. It has a unit train for coal, let's say, for example. It'll have one waybill in it. It'll be a stack of yellow cards, and they start in one yard and they go all the way to the end of the layout in the other yard. So pretty easy. Okay. Captive service is another one that's pretty easy to understand, right? And I refer to this as a ping pong routing. Okay. So for example, on my layout, the Pennsylvania Glass and Sand Mine in Berkeley Springs, which is off the Hancock yard there, actually ships cars to the Capital Cement Plant, which is off the Frog Hollow Industrial in Martinsburg, right up the line. And then when it's empty, it goes back. And that's all it does. There are cars that were just in captive service going back and forth between the two because it was a massive sand plant and a massive cement plant that constantly needed material. So also very easy, because then you give somebody with the train has a car and a car card. When it gets to its destination, all you as the layout owner need to do is take it off, and it says it's empty, route it back to where it came from. So the one cycle waybill, in other words, you don't need to use all 4 sides of the card. You only need to use 1/4 of the given waybill card. Really easy. And really prototypical type of operation as well. Okay, what about passenger service? Some of you are sitting there going, yeah, Jeff, hey, you're got a freight railroad. What about all my passenger cars? So passenger cars are also have car cards. You make a car card for it in case there's happens to be something wrong with it. You know, a bad order card you got to set off. You want to make sure you have a car card for each passenger car. But generally speaking, you're not going to set out passenger cars and pick up other ones. Sometimes you do. There are times like a sleeper car gets cut off and goes a different direction or whatever. But most of the time, you're just going to tell your operator to go to the station that's being serviced, sit there for 5 minutes so that everybody else gets frustrated and tied up as you unload and load the new passengers, right? But keep in mind, when you're doing a passenger car, there's no way bill. Okay, people are not considered a load, right? I mean, I guess theoretically every passenger has a ticket, which is kind of a waybill, but the reality is in model railroad operations, you don't use a waybill for the individual passengers. You just use the car card in case you need to have one that's bad ordered. And an extra train. Extra trains are really low priority trains, ones that aren't on the schedule. You use those if you happen to have a train that's too heavy or a train that's too long, and there's still cars that need to go in that destination or direction. So you can run an extra one. A fan trip's another good passenger extra. You know, people like running the old equipment that doesn't match their era as a fan trip. Those sort of things. That adds a lot of operational interest. Um, it is a great way, and a way that most model railroaders should think about it, is when the yard starts getting too clogged up, it's a great opportunity. I mean, to start taking extra cars out of that yard, run them as an extra to some other place, so that they free up some capacity in your yard. And you just use a waybill like you would on a normal train for an extra. The only difference is it's usually the lowest priority train, so it's usually the slowest getting over the road. And I believe this is my last slide. Maintenance of way. Um, that be it a wreck train, a ballast train, rail repair, ditching, snow removal, even your classic brass hat inspection train, you know, with the nicest cars the company owns. All of those add great operational interest. It's a great way to use cars that aren't run a whole lot, get them out there. Um, but generally speaking, way bills are not used on maintenance of way, but you would use the car card on a maintenance of way train just in case it gets bad ordered and you have to set it out somewhere. The only one I know off the top of my head that would routinely use a waybill is the delivery of sand to a locomotive facility, because that sand was purchased somewhere that wasn't owned by the railroad, but they probably used a maintenance of way covered hopper to put the sand in, and then they ship it to the locomotive facility where it sits and drains the sand into the sanding tower for all the locomotives to use. So there is one or two cases where you would use a waybill and maintenance away, but generally speaking, like a crane, for example, no. You know, flat cars that are used in maintenance away service, no. So, but very interesting to add to your operations. It's something that the car card system can help you with as well. And that is my clinic in its entirety. And this is all pre-recorded, so I guess I'll be live here in a second to take your questions.